people are there.
Yeah, so Asif is the director.
I think you can share now.
BRAC National Chamber.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's never going to be
Try again?
any kind of
Unified.
Yeah, now it's
like a person like yourself.
No, I think it will be. So they're a little bit more.
So they're on the level.
Yeah.
microphone off, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're unmuted.
Okay.
I'll check. I think she will.
Can we start now? Okay. Hello and welcome everyone to this event on COVID-19 and the ultra-poor graduation approach, evidence from Bangladesh. My name is Adnan and I'm from the School of Economics. This event is organized by BIGD, Bangladesh Institute of Governance and Development, BRAC, TICKET, IGC, LSE, the Growth and Gender in Labor Markets Initiative at IZA and FCDO and IZA. The structure of the plan for today is that I'll say a word or two about the topic, and then Oriana, the star of the show, like she will present her latest work on this. She'll present for 30 to 35 minutes. Then we'll have a series of comments from people in the room and online. So Imran and Robin will share their comments in person. Dean and Marcus and Greg Chen will share their comments from whichever part of the world they're in. We understand that there are people from different parts of the world. Then we'll open it up and we'll have questions and answers from the online forum, and my colleague Ahmed Al Sayed, so like he will share those comments. So now that we are hopefully looking at the end game of COVID, fingers crossed, we also have a sobering realization that about the cost that COVID imposed on the global agenda of poverty reduction. So millions and millions of people have been thrown back into poverty, and millions others who could have graduated have not been able to. And I think one of the most important questions facing humanity today is how do we protect the gains in terms of poverty reduction that the world had witnessed in the past 2 to 3 decades? How do we build on that progress? And how do we not let COVID have permanent economic scars on the most vulnerable global population? And this study, this project, this initiative that we are talking about today, it goes at the heart of this question, which I would say one of the most important questions, critical questions facing humanity today. So this question is about, like, this project is about the graduation approach that BRAC initiated, and that we have sufficient evidence, we have credible evidence that it actually works, and we have evidence not only from Bangladesh, but from around the world. So that's established knowledge. We know that it works, and it works in different contexts, and it works so well that there have been huge attempts at scaling it up around the world. Maybe not sufficient, but huge attempts. We'll see evidence today whether how resilient this graduation is when those who graduated benefiting from the graduation approach, ultra-poor approach, were facing the COVID-19 shock, what happened as a result. And hopefully Oriana will share the findings, and those findings are not just important for Bangladesh, I think they have a global resonance and relevance. And I hope that my colleagues who will be sharing their comments online and in person will be drawing on those lessons, policy lessons for not just Bangladesh but the wider world. So with these words, welcome again, and let me hand over to my dear colleague, Oriana. Over to you, Oriana.
Thank you so much, Adnan. And welcome everybody, and apologies for the delay, entirely my fault, and London traffic. So today I'm going to talk about, as Adnan already pronounced, poverty in the time of COVID. So this is the first time in 20 years, I think we're all aware in this room and in the virtual room, that for the first time in 20 years, the World Bank announced an increase in the number of people in global poverty, below the global poverty line. This hasn't happened in 20 years, and it's a fairly substantial increase. And the longer the pandemic goes, the farther back we go in time, in terms of numbers of poverty. So I think we've already eliminated the last 10 years of progress. Now, the question is not surprising, right, that during a pandemic of this size and so disruptive for every economic activity around the world, poverty increases. It would be absurd that this didn't happen. But the true question that we have to ask ourselves is whether once the pandemic ends, will poverty bounce back? That is, will the people who are being thrown in poverty by the pandemic come back to their state pre-pandemic? And the main, I think, lesson that we learned from targeting the ultra-poor, or UPG, now named, is that there are poverty traps. And the reason why this is important in answering the question about the permanence of the effect of the pandemic is that if you can escape the poverty trap, you can also fall back into it. So TUP was a big push. Right? The transfer was big enough that for most people, they could escape the poverty trap. And escaping the poverty trap means that they were set on a stable, sustainable trajectory out of poverty. So that was the good news. The issue, the question is whether COVID is a big pull and how many people will fall back inside the trap. Because if COVID is a shock big enough to draw people back into the poverty trap, those numbers are not going to bounce back. We are on a path of increased poverty and inequality for the foreseeable future, unless we start reshuffling people again and doing more programs like TUP or UPG. So actually, I'll show you some numbers once I show you the mechanics, but the important thing is that the success of TUP is essential because it shows this existence of the poverty trap, and it makes programs like TUP more important nowadays than they were before the pandemic. Because people are sliding into the poverty trap, TUP can bring them back up. Okay? In order to understand how that works, we have to look at the mechanics of the poverty trap. And the poverty trap goes through jobs. Now, if you look everywhere in low-income countries, low-income countries, there is a three-tier hierarchy of jobs. What we normally call jobs, that is having an employer that pays your salary every month and you have reasonable certainty that for the foreseeable future you will continue doing so, is extremely rare. And it's only the richest people that have these salary jobs. This data here comes from a nationally representative survey in urban and rural areas in Bangladesh that BIGD put together. And on the horizontal axis, you have wealth beings, and on the vertical axis, you have the share of people who do these different types of jobs. And you see that salary jobs are very rare, except in the highest wealth beings. Casual jobs are the most common form of jobs, so without guarantee of further employment, very uncertain, very poorly paid. And those are typically done by the poorest people. And in the middle, you have all the small businesses. The people that try to escape from casual jobs but haven't got a salary job yet. Okay? So TUP brings people, or UPG brings people from casual jobs onto the small businesses. So it's one jump. ahead. So the poverty trap is a simple cycle, but unfortunately a very resistant one, where no matter where you start, say that you're born without assets, then the only thing you can do is casual jobs. Casual jobs are uncertain and poorly paid. That means that you just have barely enough to survive, you cannot save, and hence the next period you're gonna be with no assets again. Your only choice is gonna be to do casual jobs, and so on forever. Now, TUP breaks the cycle at the asset point. It gives people assets which allows them to shift into small businesses. Small businesses produce more income, which allow people to save and accumulate assets. And we have we've evaluated the program. We have 2 papers on this, and then we show how over the course of 11 years, so from 2007 to 2018, people accumulate assets. Actually, the people who benefit the most from TUP are those who curtail consumption at the beginning. So you see a drop in consumption because they're saving to buy more cows and even land. So 11 years down the line, we see that some of the ultra poor have actually purchased land. Now, what does COVID do? And I'm going to show you some data from the surveys. COVID also breaks the cycle, but in a bad way. It breaks the cycle at the occupational choice. The economy shuts down, small businesses shut down. People start eating their savings, right? But because they're eating their savings, they can't grow their business. And if this lasts long enough, they will lose the business. And so there is an interaction between the success of the business and the wealth of the individual. If it lasts long enough, everybody will consume all their wealth, but for a short period of time, the poorest ones, the ones who have less savings, will lose their business, no matter how successful the business was, because the income of the business is shut down, and then it will bring you back to the old cycle. Okay? So I'm going to show you some numbers from 2 surveys. One is a survey of 7,000 households that the IGB did with PPRC in Bangladesh, and it's a nationally representative survey. The sample comes from nationally representative surveys, half in rural and half in urban areas, because we want to link it to the UPG program. I'm going to show you only the data for rural areas, because those link better with the reality that UPG deals with. And we have 3 waves. One in ECHO, at the beginning of the lockdown, that asked retrospective information on their jobs in February, before the world stopped. Okay? And then they're already surveyed again after the end of lockdown in June 20, and once more in March 21. So we can see the evolution from the beginning of the pandemic till March 21. The other survey is the survey that we did together, the C team, Robin and Imran, to survey the original beneficiaries of the UPG program, that is those that were treated in 2007. Okay? We have a 75% response rate, which is quite remarkable, I think, considering that the baseline was done 13 years ago. And this is a one-off survey which we did last summer. Okay. So this is a lot of information in a graph. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but I give you the key points. So I look for my pen so I can highlight it. So these bars here, the 4 panels are divided by the source of income in February, before the pandemic. So this is in rural areas, so you have casual workers, who are the poorest, people who run small businesses at the top, farming and livestock at the top right, and at the bottom salaried. So you have the people who run businesses at the top, on the left you have the small businesses, on the right you have farming and livestock, and at the bottom we have casual and salaried. What the bars tell you is what happened, what jobs these people did in June, so after the first lockdown, and then a year after the start of the pandemic in March. So the first thing that I want to point out is these orange bars. The orange bars tells you how many people reported no income in June, so 4 months into the pandemic. And you see that the casual laborers, who are the poorest, are also the ones who are more likely to be out of work. Okay? 24% of them had no income 4 months after the beginning of the pandemic. So if we think that the UPG moved people away from casual labor, there and then is, a piece of optimism, because you're not in the group where you have 1 chance in 4 of having no income. UPG moves people into farming and livestock or small businesses, and there are losses of income, of course, but it's a good 10 percentage points, 8 to 10 percentage points less likely to lose income. Okay. So this is about the worst case scenario, no income after the pandemic. But now I want to see whether we are falling back into the trap. So the next slide looks at how people, according to their businesses that they had in February, how many of them fall back into casual labor, because that is the trap, that is falling back into the trap. And that depends, of course, on where you started. Casual labor here is the blue. So if you had a business, you go 23% of people a year later are in casual labor. Farming and livestock is quite similar, it's 20% casual labor. So there is a drop from people who had a business into casual labor. About 1/5 of people with a business, either farming or livestock or other small business, fall into casual labor. So now we're gonna go to the TUP beneficiaries themselves and see how many of them, how do they compare to these numbers? How many of them lose their good jobs? So we don't have controls anymore, because by agreement with BRAC, in 2013, the original controls from 2007 were all treated. But as I told you at the beginning, the spectacular thing about TUP is that it allows us to prove the existence of a poverty trap. And a poverty trap, unfortunately, means that there are some people, the way we can prove it is by proving that there are some people that can't escape. And so there is a threshold level of baseline wealth such that the people who were above that threshold, the baseline, escaped the poverty trap, thanks to the program, and those below don't. So they all receive the same transfer, but those who have a little bit of assets, for them it's enough to escape. Those who have absolutely nothing, they can't. And so what I'm going to do now is to compare those two sets of people. Mind you, this is not the effect of TUP, because the effect of TUP is going to be larger, because also the beneficiaries who didn't manage to change their job and accumulate more assets, they still received a massive transfer that's like, twice their annual income, 10 times the original savings. So these are not people they are not the casual laborers, the poorest ones, because they still have received a big, but still there is a difference in the super effective UPG and the moderately effective. You can see the UPG without escape, so for those below the threshold, as a generous transfer program. Okay? So it's a generous transfer vis-a-vis a transformative transfer. That's what we're comparing here. And just before the pandemic, 13 years after the transfer, we see a difference between the people who are above the threshold and those below. Those above are more likely to have a good job, which is mostly farming and livestock, some salaried employment, but mostly farming and livestock. They have more assets, they have land, which is very remarkable, livestock, poultry, and so on. Now, what happens after the pandemic? Well, we see in this sample, 14% of people who have a business lose that business. So that's in line with the national estimates that I showed you earlier. So we have a lot, 14% of the people who had either a salary job, but most of them a business losing. The effect is about almost half for the successful ultra poor. That is, the ultra poor who managed to escape poverty because they were above the threshold actually are more resilient. They have a lower probability of losing their business or salary job. And this is important because wherever you look at consumption, these are very small tables, but it doesn't matter, I can tell you what the bottom line is. What we look at here is consumption of different foods, so vegetables, meat, eggs, fish, milk, and so on. And we see that losing a business or a good job is associated with a very large drop in consumption and a drop in assets. You're losing the business, you liquidate your assets. So what do we learn from all of this? The good news is that the program does increase resilience. The people who successfully escape the poverty trap are less likely to fall back into it than those who were not able to escape it. And also less likely to fall back into it than the nationally representative survey suggests in terms of percentages. But I think the bigger picture, that is a small sample, that is, 2,500 households who were lucky enough to be in that situation. But what we have to worry about, I think, is the millions of people who were not lucky enough to get the transfer back in 2007 and are now being dragged into poverty despite having a business. And so there is a real danger that the effect of the pandemic will actually outlive the pandemic itself. So we have to be ready, I think, to implement programs such as UPG to bring these people back, because I think the longer they stay, it's like long-term unemployment, the longer they stay, the harder it's going to be for them to get out on their own strength. And we know from the poverty traps paper that we completed with the Ultra Poor Project that the farther away you are from the threshold, the more you need to escape. So we need to implement programs quickly so that we can do it cheaper. Because the transfer that we need to bring people above the threshold, if we get them right away, is going to be smaller. And I think that's what I have to say, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Oriana. These were very interesting findings, make one reflect. I think they have clear policy implications as well. I'm sure our commenters will bring those out. So let me turn to our commenters now. At first request, Imran. Imran, can you please come in and share your comments?
Great. Am I audible? It should be audible, right? Okay. Great. Thanks a lot, Oriana. So this is really interesting, and I think what you told right at the end is what I found to be, the sort of most powerful, which is there is a time urgency in terms of getting these type of interventions scaled up very quickly in this particular context that we are at, and I think that is really important to bear in mind. I wanted to make two quick points here. So one is, I think the sort of general mechanics and dynamics that you empirically demonstrate and sort of conceptually argue for, are obviously, I think very sensible. I sort of wonder, in terms of designing this. So there are two dimensions of design challenge here. So one is urban, right? I think a lot of these, in the surveys that we have done along with PPRC, we have seen a lot of these kind of new poverty that is being created is urban in nature. So I think there is a design challenge in terms of, or innovation that is really required in terms of, how does the urban graduation model really looks like. And again, global evidence based on this is going to be really important. So this is sort of one, I think, dimension. The other is a lot of these new poor were not poor before. So So the ultra poor program is designed for chronic poor people, whereas the challenge that we have right now is designing a graduation program for new poor. And the psychology and the aspirational dimension of this new poor category is very different from a chronic poor on whom the ultra poor graduation model is basically based. And I think these are two design challenges that I think I would just like to highlight that we need to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. Let's turn over to Robin.
Hello, everyone. So just a couple of thoughts. The first is to kind of focus very heavily on the occupational change part of this, because what you see if you look across development, essentially that's the driver of welfare improvement. So I guess a kind of way to put that is if you compare Korea and Bangladesh. So if Bangladesh would like to become Korea, then there's a whole set of occupational changes that happen beyond small businesses. So it's a bigger businesses, start-up, organizations like that. And I think one big question in this whole literature on social protection is to what extent do we want to think of this as social protection? To what extent do we want to think of it as kind of a mobility enhancer that then may lead in time to even more meaningful jobs and livestock business and so on? I think that latter bit is important both theoretically but also for policy, because how does one move somebody who's in a livestock business to something else? And that's why I keep coming back to occupation, because the interesting thing about the 11 years is you do start to see something that looks like moving beyond the ultra poor program, and I think we need to study that part of it. That was sort of the first point. And then going back to what Imran said, there may be, funny enough, a case here for targeting people who are not very, very poor in the situation of COVID, because some of those people who were running highly productive businesses, but who are poor in an asset sense, when the shock hits, they go out of business before their more wealthy counterparts who are less productive. And so if you want to get the maximal sort of bang for your buck, you may want to try to get them back into business rather than focus on people who never did any type of business. And again, that gets to that kind of mobility occupation change thing. So that, and then the second sort of different point is that the COVID shock could be seen as a bit of a laboratory for understanding how to deal with other shocks, because it's a very big shock. It's a bit like a war, really. And I was just up in Glasgow in COP26, and a lot of the discussion there was rather general about these things. It didn't really have, I think people are worried about climate change, there's adaptation, a lot of words. But actually, maybe we should be thinking about, Imran mentioned adapting to urban, which is partly because a lot of new poor in the urban areas. But the whole set of questions around, as it gets hotter, as there's other shocks, how do programs like this protect people? And one thing which is very specific there is migration, because obviously the people who are in the countryside in Bangladesh and Africa and so on are going to be more at risk. And so maybe the thing is not to just find them jobs in the countryside, but to assist them in moving to more modern areas like cities where you see more of the types of Korean type jobs appearing. So I think that's another set of issues which it doesn't have to all be through the ultra poor, a whole range of things. And then I guess the final point is that the set of people that we're talking about, I've always been talking about, which are the very, very poor. In some ways, they could become employees of large organizations, and perhaps that's one of the things that's missing certainly in the rural economies of Bangladesh. So what I'm left with is this notion of kind of structural change, and this is kind of a very micro form of it. But how do we kind of bring the camera out and think about what other factors could actually help people to move into more meaningful jobs? That might also mean focusing on a different age profile of people, so people who are, say, coming out of school, going into jobs, not already kind of in the worst jobs, because again, you might get more of an impact from your money. But I think we do need to kind of think about how to accelerate that occupational change. That's sort of the central thing, which, to be honest, is not just social protection, it's something broader than that. And I think we need to think a little bit more broadly than just protecting people. We need to actually enable people to do better jobs. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. I think we're already getting a fascinating discussion. So starting from Oriana's work, showing us the differential impact in terms of resilience of different groups who were exposed and not exposed to the ultra-poor program. And then the follow-up comments by both Imran and Robin on new forms of poverty, the urban poor, the question about structural transformation, mobility and occupational change, and how does one think of that, both in general and as a complement to efforts aimed at social protection versus enabling the poor in a wider economy to also to support occupational change and broader change. I think those are fascinating discussions that I hope during the later discussion and question and answer we'll be coming back to some of those questions. Now let me ask Dean, who has been patiently waiting for a long time. It's from a very early hour in, I think, Central Time. So thanks for joining at such an odd hour, and over to you, Dean.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, daylight savings kicked in. I didn't even realize it. It was 5:30 here. All's good. Makes for a very nice, productive day. And okay, great. So I was going to basically, hopefully, pack this into 5 minutes. Want to share some thoughts on the Bangladesh results, and then some results from elsewhere that share a lot of the same basic conclusions. So, first, just some really obvious points. I won't belabor this. We've, seen data. We're well aware. But, one of the things that, focus in a lot of cases was very much, am I on mute?
No, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay. I made the mistake of doing full screen and then I couldn't see anybody. And it's very disconcerting to just talk into your own slides. There we go. And so there's we have a paper we put out, Edgar et al., that had evidence from 9 countries, some of which was Bangladesh, showing income drops. The range was huge, 8 to 87%, but most of them were on the top end, median 68%. Relevant for Bangladesh here, the income drop was 70 to 80%. That's the proportion of people that experience some sort of income drop. Rural food insecurity, which is obviously the kind of the type of sample that we're dealing with here, rural poor. Was as high as 70%. Elsewhere in Bangladesh, it was not quite as bad, but the point here is about the massive shock that happened. And the unfortunate reality is that a lot of countries were focused on themselves. I mean, we're seeing crises around the world. It is a different kind of shock. I completely agree with Robin's point. There's a lot that we can learn here about coping and vulnerability. We talk about a lot how the idea of being poor isn't just about the level of income, the level of consumption, it's about the vulnerability. Well, this is, talking about a shock. The problem, of course, as, the econometrician and all of us is kind of, it's hard when like the shock's everywhere, right? So there's no ability to compare, places shocked, less shocked in quite the same way. There are gradations, there's exposure to the shock and things of that nature that might be a way of seeing this. So my main comments on the Bangladesh results. First, the most impressive factoid about graduation is the persistence. This is, we are seeing this elsewhere too, not quite as strong a persistence usually in some of the other places where we do have long-term results that we're now getting in. We do see some that are as strong, I think even stronger, but we also see some that are weaker. No surprise that there's going to be variation. And that's obviously a call to action to us researchers to kind of try to figure out why. Like, why is it the country, the economics? Is it about the other policies in the country? Is it about the implementation that was simply done better in some places than others? Is it the design of the program? So this is a big open question, which hopefully we're starting to see more and more work in kind of a 2.0 style, where a lot of components are. And I know Marcus will be presenting on some of those in a moment. One thing, obviously, and I know Oriana, you made reference to this, like why the control group was ruled out to, and so you can't do treatment versus control in this context. A slight concern of the kind of the keys under the streetlight problem here, where if we can't do that, then it's not, then maybe we need to look elsewhere to answer this research question. We know that the rich will be rich and the poor will be poor to some large extent. There's obviously movement around poverty, but some of that is just a nature of, and so, to some extent, you look at the results and you're struggling with how much to think about this as just a fact of life. The rich are rich and the poor are poor, or how much to think about this as a true separation that is by luck about being above or below a threshold. So then on the threshold, my takeaway from the work on the threshold is really more about the poverty is persistent and a big push may be needed, but it's not about there's being one kind of this threshold. There is no magic threshold. Certainly not a universal magic threshold, but even in any context, there's not going to be a threshold that is of that nature, and that there's if you're missing, for instance, low cost assets, there's a mass at zero that gives this false illusion of that. And we've seen that in other Bangladesh data. We're able to generate the bimodal distribution, but when we limit to fewer assets. But when you have a full list of assets, we do not see the bimodal distribution. So I'm very hesitant to kind of I would be hesitant to push the threshold as a kind of regression discontinuity approach, and I would focus more on just recognizing that there is evidence of the big push mattering. There is big evidence of but where exactly that happens is not something that gives us the opportunity to use a regression discontinuity kind of approach. The other challenge, of course, is that there's a lot more than happening than starting asset base. Those programs often will argue that they have really strong psychosocial components, including the BRAC program. The hand-holding of the weekly visits is a big part of what is at least talked about by the program, and that's obviously has nothing to do with the threshold. And same thing that some people will have psychosocial constraints that hold them back, and so again, it makes it so that using a threshold in that way, I think, muddies the analysis and makes it a bit riskier. So on to that, let me show you some comparison of results. The one that we could do the cleanest comparison is with Uganda. So I tried matching up to the actual numbers in the Bangladesh paper that was shared with us, as close as we could for where we had. And these were data that were collected in right kind of in the heart of when COVID was, when lockdowns and things like that were happening as well. So on the right is just a redo of the Bangladesh results, but I converted everything to a % of the comparison group so that we could try to have a kind of a numerator, a scaling here to compare. And the results are really strikingly similar. So the first column to look at is the one on the rich minus poor, which is the kind of replication of the approach, so to speak, that the Bangladesh paper takes.
So,
and
Slides then.
here we can't see your slides.
Oh, yeah, I moved it on the wrong one. Sorry, there we go. Oh, no, you can't see. Wait, what are you seeing then? Which slide?
We're only seeing you. Can you share your?
Oh, I thought you were seeing these. Sorry, what did I do wrong? Oh, I just see. Sorry, it's my first time on Zoom. Okay, there we go. But now you're seeing a blank screen, or are you seeing the slides? Which one do you have on?
You see your slide 4.
No, now we see your
Okay.
Now you see your home screen.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start over now. Just so the right column here, you got them right now?
You need to make it full screen.
Now it's in presenter mode, so we see the small slide, the big slide.
Okay, I got a full screen. So hold on one second. There we go. Go to this one. My God, it still wants to do it the other way around. Sorry. I think I just hit the wrong one when I hit, that's all. I just hit the wrong screen when I. Okay, now you're seeing the right one or no?
We're still seeing the presenter mode.
Why is it not letting me? Oh, you know why? I think I'm on a, let me Is it readable or is it just not readable?
It is readable.
Okay, let's just stick with this. It's not as perfect, I realize, but okay, let's just stick with this. So the Bangladesh results on the right are just a conversion of what was done, where I just took the treatment, the difference between rich and poor, and divided by poor to get a sense of scale that can compare across countries more easily. In terms of jobs, we're seeing similar difference when we also compare rich versus poor within our sample. We do see much bigger treatment of, I don't want to call them treatment effects in our context, certainly, but differences between rich and poor. But some of that is, like I said before, that's just going to be the cross-sectional variation that's natural when just rich people versus poor. At one time later on, the rich are still rich and the poor are still poor. Obviously, even within a highly selected sample. So when we look at our actually treatment effects, treatment versus control, we still see some actually dramatic impacts, not quite as big on a few of these, but in terms of likelihood of having had a job and still having a job, 68%. Again, these are the treatment effect divided by the control group mean is what all of these are in this column in order to have a scale. Livestock assets are basically almost double the treatment group versus control. Poultry assets are, about 2/3 higher. Goat assets are almost exactly double that of the control group. So these were, in the middle of COVID, showing the program providing that boost. Now, what we don't know, of course, is would the boost have been bigger? Would it have been smaller? Or is it just a level effect that was kind of constant? We obviously don't know that. That's kind of the million-dollar question. In the Philippines, similar really striking positive results, not quite as much across the board. The devastation there is equally clear, 68% reduced food consumption, 29% skipped health services. And then when we look at the treatment effects, we have a 7 to 13 percentage point fewer reduced food consumption, 7 to 9 percentage points fewer reduced skipping health services. This is from a phone survey done kind of in the middle of the lockdown and kind of period of time. So the impact on coping is, look, this is a tough issue. This is to get at. We're all kind of well aware of this as economists who think about these issues. One is the econometric approach, which I think hopefully we'll start seeing more of with some of the data that come out from this, where we have predictors of vulnerability that you can do when you have panel data, and then test whether results are heterogeneous with respect to predictors of vulnerability. This is a general approach, and hopefully we'll start seeing more of this, but predicting vulnerability is obviously very difficult and is context specific. And the shocks are endogenous, which is why we have a hard time just knowing how to get our head around studies which just interact with the shock and then say, well, let's see whether they coped better. So it's not unsolvable, but it's tricky, and you also have to be lucky to get this right. And a bit of concern as a producer of research, but also someone cares deeply about the policy, that we're going to kind of migrate our policy to the studies that get lucky. And by lucky, I mean able to predict vulnerability, able to predict coping, things of this nature, and then all of a sudden we kind of overthink our results because we look at these, the few times that things work out so nicely with the econometrics and able to predict, and we try to set policy from those. And so we, I think the real value in this is going to come from policy when we're starting able to put together lots of different studies and I looked at people like Rachel Meager on that kind of work, and I think that's, in my view, some of the most exciting stuff that hopefully can come out of this is just is what the common results are that we can actually attribute across many places. There's also a programmatic approach, which I think this hopefully will bring more attention to. How do you develop coping skills, cognitive behavioral therapy? I think Marcus is going to talk about Niger results, which have the strong psychosocial. And the third ... refers to the danger of giving a talk at 5:30 in the morning is that you go to bed thinking about it, and then having some really great idea that you definitely want to add to your slides, and you forget what it is when you wake up. Sorry, I don't remember what 3 was. Those are my thoughts. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Dean. That was great food for thought. But before discussion, let's move to Marcus. Can you start unsharing your screen? Yes.
Thanks. I don't have slides, so hopefully it'll be simpler. I think the way I'm going to approach it is at the World Bank, and a lot of the discussions have been about how to build back and maybe even build back better. And I want to make 2 points building on what Oriana and Imran said. I think the first point is Imran talked about design challenges, and I want to add one more. I want to focus on the gender dimensions of the COVID shock and think about how we can bring graduation programs to help us to overcome this. And so one piece of the gender dimensions of COVID is that women suffered the shock more, and the specific data point I wanted to talk about is firm closure. So in sub-Saharan Africa, we think of small businesses as the start of the route out of poverty. And here, what we did is we used a global data set of firms that have a Facebook business page, and we surveyed them every 6 weeks or so during 2020. And what we found was that female firms are 4 percentage points more likely to have closed. Why? Well, when we control for a bunch of things, including proxies for economic activity, which obviously this is the mega shock everyone's talking about, school closure. When schools closed, women did more care work. Men, they started doing more care work at the beginning of the epidemic, but they quickly figured out how to not. And so by the end, they're doing less. So maybe as we think about graduation programs, and particularly graduation programs that target women, we can build back better. Just to add to the evidence that we had from Bangladesh, we've seen one in Nigeria. This is pre-COVID, but this is a sizable cash transfer program done by CRS in northern Nigeria. And the really interesting result there was that in the first year after the program, the women started businesses, the direct beneficiaries, and had significantly higher earnings. That was great. The cool thing, and this sort of helps us think about the recovery trajectory from COVID, is that in the second year, the other ultra poor women who didn't receive the program, and this was concentrated among the ultra poor, start businesses, and they look like complementary businesses. So there's this neat sort of village growth kind of story that came out of that. So that's my first point, is like, we really have to think about the gender dimensions. How persistent is the shift in care that we saw, and how can we use these programs to really help us recover? The second point is how to deliver. And if we're going to do this, we're going to have to do this at a fairly big scale. And so we've been doing some work, that Dean alluded to this, in Niger with a government-funded graduation program. And as he indicated, it had pretty neat results. We're trying to unpack different dimensions of the package. And as he said, the skills, the psychosocial skills-based version, as compared to a sort of asset-based version, had a particularly high rate of return. They both worked, but the rate of return was great on the skill side. On the other hand, we have Zambia, where we have some very preliminary results. Again, a very similar thing. Now here it's government funded, but also government implemented. And so here we're seeing nice impacts from the financial asset, but not such great results from the training skills part of things. So, tying it back, all the way back to Imran's initial comments, I think we really have to think about, as we deliver this, who can deliver it and who can deliver it with the maximal return at a time when we really need it. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcus. Let's now move to Greg Chen.
Yeah, hi everyone. Good to see some old friends here. So I've been a longtime follower of graduation work, but I'm sort of coming back to it again and getting refreshed. So I think you can take my comments one of two ways: either sort of straight out of ignorance, or you can take them as maybe a bit of a sort of a coming back to it after a period away, a bit of a fresh perspective. So maybe just a comment on the Bangladesh data. I mean, it seemed to me, so to one of Robin's earlier comments, I think the graduation program in Bangladesh was always envisioned as something not part of a broader social protection scheme, but something that was there when there were no formal mechanisms for social protection. And there was this group that clearly, as Bangladesh started to progress, there was this group being left behind. And so I think that speaks to some of the poverty traps that were mentioned in the first presentation. You know, as we've with COVID, you know, clearly a lot of, you know, it's been this much wider systemic shock. And so I think the question I have to some of the earlier comments about who are the new poor and what kind of mechanisms might work for them. One of my questions is whether they are in fact falling back into a poverty trap, or whether we might see some broader restructuring of the economy, whether as hopefully as this moves from pandemic to endemic stage, people might find their footing again, perhaps maybe in a different way than they did before. Perhaps it's systemic and wide enough, but I'm not ready to assume yet that everyone or there would be a larger number of people would fall back into the same kind of extreme poverty that we had seen before. I think that still needs to play out. So that's just a broader comment that I think this systemic thing changes so many different things that you know our look at graduation has to be seen through that broader lens. I think Bangladesh provides a fairly unique example of people who were in poverty traps came out possibly at risk of falling back in. We don't necessarily have that kind of data and those kinds of opportunities in other countries where graduation type approaches have been around for less long and have not hit the same kind of numbers that we've hit in Bangladesh. So those are just some broader comments, fresh back looking at this. I won't go on much longer. I think you know, I'm very curious to hear what the conversation is, and thanks for letting me join. It's great to be back and closer again to this issue. So I look forward to interacting with everybody more down the road.
Thank you, Greg. This was a fascinating discussion on such an important topic, so much food for thought. Before we turn over to the questions from the online audience, I wanted to give, like all panelists, Oriana, starting from Oriana and others, a chance to maybe to react to some of the comments that others have mentioned. With one thing that I would add as a request, given these findings and this discussion, what would your message be to policy actors, government, BRAC, and to donors?
So thank you so much, everybody, for very insightful comments. I think I have a couple of things to say. I don't know what the best way of doing it is. Okay, not with this. The first thing about identification, Dean, of course, there is no identification here. There is no randomized control trial. We didn't randomize COVID. We didn't randomize anything. But the descriptives, I think, speak loud. And going to the urban areas is even louder. There is this trade-off between your wealth and your earnings. So the richer people, the wealthier people are more likely to survive their business. And people who have higher earnings are also more likely to survive. When you put them together, you get a nice downward sloping frontier, which means that if we leave it at that, we're going to have a more unequal and also more inefficient allocation of people to businesses, which resonates a lot with Marcus's point, because it's not just on the wealth dimension that there's going to be more inequalities, on the gender dimension too, and maybe even more so. Coming back to Imran's point is, how do we design effective programs? And this, I think, you know, we've been seeing all these mountains of evidence. What really matters here is to give people the opportunity to do the job which they can do best. That is the bottom line. It's not tinkering at the margin with more training, more behavioral therapy, more of this, more of that. I think we really have to think hard on how to make sure that people have access to the job that they can do best. BRAC has fantastic programs on the training side that we're working with in Bangladesh, where we look at how to make sure that people who have the skills to be hairdressers get training in hairdressing, even if they can't afford it. So it's ways of combining the finance aspect with the training aspect. So I think, to me, this is the key thing that we have to think about, how to better match people to jobs. Because once we have that, everything else will follow.
And what would your message be to policy actors and donors?
My message to policy actors and donors is to act fast, which is, act fast with a lot of money too. But what I really would like to convey is that it's not a zero-sum game. If we used to think of growth as a needed, necessary thing to reduce poverty, but if you think about it, these type of interventions mean that reducing poverty will cause growth. Because if you allocate people, if you give people the chance to do the job that they're best at, they're going to be more productive, and the whole economy is going to benefit. So it's not like throwing money down the drain or just doing charity work. It's actually building the basis of a more sustainable growth.
Thanks, very well put. Imran, Robin, you want to come back with any further comments?
I just have one. I mean, I think what Robin started off, and Oriana agrees. In terms of, I think ultra poor graduation, for a long time we've been kind of thinking about it more in a kind of a social protection, within a social protection space. I think we need to, especially with the COVID context, I think it sort of forces us to think about it more broadly. And I think that has got policy implication, political implication. I think that's something we need to kind of think seriously about, and advocacy strategy as well. I think it's got implications for that. So that's sort of one thought. The other is intergenerational. I think we need to think about these transformations that Robin talked about, structural transformation, occupational transformation. We need to think about it in a more intergenerational context. And I think the impact of the graduation program in terms of next generation, we haven't really studied it as robustly, as strongly, and whatever evidence we have is pretty mixed. And I think this is another design challenge. How do we design the graduation program to have intergenerational graduation impact and transformative impact?
Thank you, Imran. Robin, do you have any follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, I guess on the policy side, I think an important point is just to be practical. So as everybody's been saying, this is our knowledge base right now. There's an urgent challenge right now. Act on that. So this is a program that seems to do well. It's got to do everything, but it does well. And so there is a huge case for just putting a lot of money into trying to get people back on their feet. But I think just going back to sort of being very clear that this is not the only lever one can pull, because the key thing here is occupational change. So whether you're in Motherwell in Scotland, or Glasgow in Scotland, or you're in Zambia or in Bangladesh, there's different levers that can get pulled. Some of those might be human capital levers, some of them might be asset levers. And so obviously the threshold we looked at in Bangladesh is specific to that very simple occupational structure. It does not rule out that if you were doing this, a big push in urban Bangladesh or in Glasgow, that the lever would look different. So there's a little bit of a question of what other levers might work. And I guess the final thing is we think about future challenges, whether they're more pandemics or climate change and so forth. The critical thing actually, which people don't think about, is that the growth itself, the occupational change, actually offers protection, because we're no longer in the firing line of climatic shocks and health shocks in the way that the rural people of Bangladesh were. And so that's a great argument for pushing these types of programs, pushing education on the human capital as a program to get people into different jobs where they're already more protected from these future shocks. And it's often seen as a sort of a trade-off, but it's not. The very act of encouraging occupational change makes people more resilient.
Thank you, Robin. Dean, do you want to come back on to have any further comments?
I think, I think I'll just say one thing broadly, which is that, this question of occupational choice is, obviously at some level it's at the heart of these programs, and there's a lot of variety over space on them. I mean, one of the most exciting results I think that we learned from the team here's earlier work from Bangladesh was the diversification and into other things. That was, kind of exhilarating to see that kind of transformation happen, because there's no doubt when you kind of do the kind of comparisons that Robin was referring to earlier across countries, and you think about what does it mean to just be a wealthier country, and you do see these massive transformations in that, and that's exhilarating. We don't always see that, so why? That's the challenge, that's the struggle. We've seen some really good results from the graduation program elsewhere, but without that, for instance, what do we think about that? I don't know. Is that just about Bangladesh? Was it something about what BRAC was doing in the program, in the design? These are all the kinds of questions I have. I don't have answers, but so.
Thanks, Dean. Marcus?
I don't have anything to add.
And Greg, any final comments before we? Okay, let me hand over to my colleague Ahmed for sharing, asking comments, questions from the online audience. Over to you, Ahmed.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Adnan. We have got several interesting questions, but before getting these questions to Oriana and panelists, Jonathan Agua from IFAD has a comment that he would like to share with us.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Greetings to you from Abidjan in Ivory Coast, where I am sitting and looking after IFAD's rural finance portfolio over 24 countries of the West and Central Africa. I am part of the, focal points in IFAD for graduation programming. And I think we used to organize some big events, and I see, quite some of you that I know. And I love the intervention of Greg Chen, which kind of sits well with us as practitioners. And you know that IFAD is very much focused on the rural poor, where we are actually looking for evidence of impact of COVID around the rural poor, and it is very difficult to find it out. But we assume that it is there. From a practitioner's point of view, instead of going back to the regular graduation programming, we have since set up the value chain approach, pro-poor value chain approach, which integrates all segments of the value chain, from labor provision, where the ultra poor come in, through production and productivity enhancement, all the way to marketing. This is an aspect of scaling up of the graduation programming, where we no longer do the 18 months, 24 months intervention. We have gone past that level, and we are now doing self-identification of the ultra poor and linking them up to pro-poor value chains, making sure that they explore their most available asset, which is their labor. If you can provide your labor into some of the activities of the pro-poor value chain, then we match the equivalence of your labor with savings. So we do matching savings. You provide your labor, and that labor either generates a decent job for you, or you do some self-employment with that decent job. And there are a myriad of activities in the rural market space now for those people at the base of the income pyramid. So they begin to find themselves more productively useful. We no longer look at them as people who ought to be only on the consumption side. We make them realize that they are more productive, they are very useful in the economy, wherever they are within, the base of the pyramid. There are programs that we have learned from the graduation programming, including subsidies and grants, and now savings mobilized as a contribution towards using these savings for investment purposes. We have projects going on now. It's a new wave of projects going on in about, I think, 16 of my 24 countries, where we are doing graduation programming without calling it that way anymore. And we make these guys feel themselves more useful. A very successful example is one that, I don't know whether some of you speak French, but the word that is still being used that sounds a little bit derogatory is in Mali. We call them les diminués, the ultra poor. But these guys, you will be surprised that we introduced them to matching savings financial product. And after 6 months, introducing them into an economic activity, they use the savings, which we have helped them mobilize, as cash collateral to get an interest-bearing loan to invest in an economic activity which they have identified that is linked to the pro-poor value chain. And believe you me, the guys are doing fine. You would imagine that an ultra-poor who has been handheld to mobilize savings suddenly goes for an interest-bearing loan without hitting the mark of 18 months. And they're doing good, very good. In terms of COVID and what we are doing to those who might have been affected by COVID in the rural community, IFAD has asked all of us, the rural finance people, to do a lot of loan reschedulings. The poor people who might have taken loans are unable to pay because of logistics problems. They were unable to deliver their crop because COVID did not affect crop production. You want to believe this? A lot of the COVID came around when people were already on their farms. They already had their inputs in place. They produced, but because of travel restrictions, they could not sell. But because they were mainly producing food, governments in many of these countries relaxed travel for, transporters who were going to bring food from the rural production sites into the urban areas where food was much needed. So the impact of COVID on the rural poor was not much felt. We did not want to spend resources to find out if it was there or not. We just put, practical measures in place that will help them continue. And so loan rescheduling, reduction of interest rates, giving them more grants, but hand-holding them to employ these grants into productive activities are some of the many multiple things that we're doing. I thought I should share this with you. I have shared a knowledge product that just came out this week, and I gave it to, I think, one of the organizers to share it with you, where we are looking at the various financial products, starting with the graduation programming and how these various experiments have been carried out in West and Central Africa and how they're gaining ground and actually taking people out of, ultra poverty into something better than that. And we hope that they wouldn't fall back because we are attaching them to pro-poor value chains. And whoever speaks value chain knows that in a typical value chain, you are producing to deliver to a known market. You're not just, jumping around and looking for a market to sell your product. So that is what we are putting in place at IFAD, and we hope that this comes across like we have actually scaled up the graduation approach, and we are now into business a lot with the poor people. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I hope they will share that product that we just delivered with you. But I'm here till the end just in case, this aroused some interest and some questions, clarifications from you back to me. Thank you and over. Greg, it was nice hearing from you. Greg, hey.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jonathan. We have got a couple of questions.
Can I respond to this before? Because this is exactly the spirit of the graduation program. The spirit of the graduation program is to enable people what they can do best. And so if by giving them the opportunities, the link with the value chain allows them to choose what they know, because after all, people know what they can do best. Yes. Enabling them is what it takes. So it's really great to hear about this program. I look forward to reading in detail the account of what happened.
Okay.
Great. So the first question we have here is a question that we received from two people, actually. Chairs Raid from Okris, UK, who's working on social protection in Bangladesh, and Mahbub Hussein. They both ask about the safety nets and the different products that the different governments in developing countries, including the government of Bangladesh, is doing right now to help people, including, for example, food support. So to what extent these programs could have benefited those people, the joblessness people, and help them escape poverty, or at least reduce the impact. So do we have any evidence on this in your study, for example, Oriana?
On government programs, not really. I think we did ask in the surveys, in the BIGD survey, they did ask whether they were receiving government benefits. And actually, there is something kind of perverse, because in order to receive government benefits, you have to be on the radar of the government. So those who are on the radar are the people who have regular salary jobs, which, as we've seen, are the richest people, and also the ones who are less at risk to losing their job. So it seems like the benefits that go through traditional channels, where you need to be on the radar of the government, actually hit the people who need it the least. I think Imran.
No, I think
yeah. Okay.
Cool. We have also another question or contribution from Donna Harris, CSAE, University of Oxford, who together with her team worked on a study. I think she didn't mention this, but I just Googled it. I think it's in Ethiopia, where they follow people over time during the crisis, during the pandemic, starting from June 2020. And she's asking, she's raising the point about heterogeneity across different types of respondents. So according to her study, in the first few months, everyone was hit very hard by the pandemic, but then small business owners bounced back more quickly than daily laborers who didn't see their incomes improving much due to lack of jobs. I think this is pretty much in line with what you showed us. So she's asking here, how do we design a program? How can we design a program which targets different groups? Because those people are different, and apparently what could work for a group of them doesn't necessarily fit the others.
Absolutely. So there is, we've been talking about how to target the casual laborers, because these are the most vulnerable group. And, in rural areas, there is a transition that you can do from a casual laborer to small cultivator or small livestock business. In urban areas, it's a lot more challenging. So all the army of maids, of people who work on a daily basis without any guarantee of further employment, we have to think this is really the most vulnerable category, and other than, while we wait to find a solution to get them into better jobs, we do have to find a way of targeting them. I completely agree. We don't have an answer for that. I agree it's the most vulnerable group, and is the hardest one to reach.
Sure. I have a question here to Marcos from Kate Proki, who's a PhD candidate at University of Cambridge. Just to pick up on one of Marcus' points, you mentioned that the time women spent on care work increased and then decreased once again. Do we know why the time spent in care work decreased? Is there any evidence that this was due to the problem of greater care time burdens somehow being solved? And if so, how this happened?
Okay, sorry. So I think I can't claim Dean's time zone, but I can claim that it was early in the morning, so it probably wasn't totally clear. So basically, I think what we see is that when schools close, controlling for economic activity and everything else as best we can, women spend more time on care. And that's unambiguous during the entire year plus that we follow this sample of people. What we see for men is there's an initial helping out thing, and then they really go the other way. And so men are doing less care when schools close. And so women are doing more, they're picking up. I mean, this is a sample of entrepreneurs, so we're sort of assuming in this structure that these women are married to these men, which they aren't. It's not a sample of couples, but we are seeing that there's a disproportionate burden on women, and men are shirking, basically. And that seems to be what's driving the closure, the disproportionate female closure we're seeing, or that part that I was talking about, those 4 percentage points.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from Andrew Gatas. He's asking, this threshold that we are talking about, like the poverty trap thing, it should be different from one country and one context to the other. Is there a way to determine this a priori, or how exactly we can determine this threshold, and what exactly the factors that could determine this threshold from one society to the other?
No, absolutely. It's very different across countries and across societies because the production structure is different. Here is the threshold in terms of livestock assets and productive assets in a rural economy. If you look at an urban setting, it will probably be a threshold in terms of wealth which you need to acquire education. So it is the technical way of doing it is that if you get in an area and you can plot the distribution of assets, if you find a space where nobody is, there is a level of wealth that nobody has, the threshold is likely to be around there, because the defining characteristic of the threshold is that you can't be in it. If you're to the left, you become poorer, and if you're above it, you become richer. So that's one way of identifying it. But of course, it's very data intensive. But by no means we think it's in number of cows or chickens everywhere around the world.
Another question by Donna Harris, a follow-up question. She's asking whether the graduation programs could help the poor deal with the compounded effect of other crises, for example, political conflict or natural disasters on top of COVID. In other words, the poor are fighting multiple crises at once. So in designing the program, how do we take care, or how do we take this into account?
I think it's by reducing poverty, you're reducing the vulnerability to all types of shocks. So I don't think it's like we can target one shock at a time, because
Atia Rahman has a question. Can we take the very last question by Atia? You are on mute, Atia.
Sorry. Thank you, Oriana, for the presentation and other panelists for discussing the issue. So I just would like to add one point about the gender dimension. So panelists have already discussed about the urban intergenerational issue and gender dimension, but I think when we think of introducing any kind of psychosocial intervention, we must think of including the male members and other family members as well, not only the woman part. Because as we have already said that women are facing re-entry barriers to the labor market. Also, they have to spend their time for caregiving at home during the COVID. So I think if we can design any intervention, including the family members and male members and their husbands, so it will help them to understand the social norm and change the understanding about the burden on the woman. And regarding the skill, I think from the operational part that you mentioned about, so we must think of some relevant skill and relevant training, which will help the people to cope with this kind of sudden shock and unprecedented incidents. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for letting me talk.
I think that's an excellent point that Tia made, because the problem, targeting women to solve a problem that's not created by women is unlikely to work.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ahmed. I think we have almost run out of time. Unless there are any final comments from either Oriana or any of the panelists, I think I'm not. Doesn't look like one. I think it was a fascinating discussion with very clear policy lessons and also a message, a plea for both urgency and also a plea for scaling up these interventions. What I also took it from this discussion is maybe a broad message about the power of economic analysis in terms of designing effective interventions, evaluating those and scaling those up, but also refining them given new shocks and new realities, but also using theory and data to think of the mechanism, to think of linking these specific interventions to the agenda of broader economic transformation, occupational change, mobility. That's a fascinating agenda. That's much relevant. That's one of the most important questions that we have in global development today. That's also an agenda that links with the current, one of the most critical agendas of climate change also. So the agenda of poverty reduction, resilience, occupational change, and how that helps us with tackling the huge challenges of climate change. Fascinating discussions, huge lessons for not just the researchers, but primarily for policy actors and donors. So on this note, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, the presenters. Thank you, Oriana, Imran, Robin, Dean, Marcus, and Jonathan also. Greg, thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna.